Today on Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Janis Daly, author and creator of the 31 Titles of Women in History list, as well as Gail Olmsted, Piper Hughley, Denny S. Bryce, and myself, 4 authors to be excited to be included on this list. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Yeah. So, Janis, as we get started, why don't you kind of give everyone like a brief introduction as to the 31 Titles in Women's History celebration and like where it came from, how you came up with it, what's included, that kind of thing.
Sure, great. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be on today and talk about the project. And thank you to the other authors that are joining us, because that's really where I like to start, is to think about the 30, because yes, I'm one of the 31 authors on the list, but the other authors that have found women's stories that we really haven't heard about in history. And it's really kudos to them for finding their stories, researching them, and bringing them to life through historical fiction. So March 2025 is Women's History Month again. And this is my 3rd year I'm out with a list of 31 titles to read to celebrate women's history. They really are an opportunity for readers to discover, learn, and celebrate those women in history individually or collectively. So it could be a biography through historical fiction or a collection of women that are representing women in history. That their achievements have really languished in the shadows and waiting for authors like all of us here today to find those stories and for readers to embrace them. Just real quick, I want to let folks know, how did I come up with the list? And it's a challenge every year, but we are also fortunate that more and more authors are writing these books. So I know that there are a lot more that are certainly worthy of inclusion, and maybe they'll be on next year's list, but to whittle it down to 31 different titles each year, I do use a set criteria. And I look for recommendations from other readers every year, as well as what's on my own library shelf. So first, I do like to be historical fiction. So not biographies or memoirs. I think historical fiction attracts a wider readership. Right. So that's getting the story out there. I want to celebrate women, so it's women authors only. Certainly, there are other books that have been written by male authors as well, but we're celebrating women, so let's do it all in. Diversity in the authors themselves, cultural, and when I talk about diversity, I'm also talking about type of publishing. So some of us are with the big 5, some of us are with indie presses, and some of us are even self-published. But they're all great stories, and I want to make sure that all of them are coming forward. Diversity in the subject herself of the book. And again, that's cultural as well as time period, field of their recognition and setting. And then, yes, I made a first cut by looking at Goodreads ratings because I want to make sure it is a well-written book that folks will want to pick up. So that's the criteria I used, and a lot of reading to get done. Thank goodness also for audiobooks, can help me double getting the books listened to as well. And then just one other quick note I'd like to leave with folks as an overview of the program is to remember that it is historical fiction. And we're going to talk a little bit later, I think, about research. And certainly I know that every single author on this list has exhaustively researched her subject. Mm-hmm. But it's also fiction, historical fiction, which means that we can dive into the sights and sounds and sensations and the emotions of what we imagine the person must have been going through during her story. So I always advise folks, read the author notes too. So that's where the authors are disclosing where the fact is and where the fiction comes in, just so you're not surprised in any way. And I think that's important. And I know we all spend a lot of time on writing our author's notes as well.
Right. Well, thank you for that, Janis. And she's right. There is a huge breadth of books out there about different women. So let's just talk real briefly about what we've written. We're going to start with Gail. She wrote Catherine's Remarkable Journey. Gail, tell us just a little bit about what they'll find when they open up that cover.
Yeah, it's actually Catherine's Remarkable Road Trip. I wanted to get the
I'm so
Remarkable
sorry.
Road Trip.
Yes,
that's okay. I first came across Catherine Prescott Wormley, a real woman, British born, came to the United States when she was 18. I first started seeing notes, references to her when I was doing research for another novel. And everything I found, there was so much contradiction and so much information that just made me think, this is an interesting woman. I want to kind of circle back to her at some point. So I did, and found just amazing woman. She, like I said, was born in England, came here at 18. Her father was in the military, and she had family money. She had plenty of great education, schooled in London and Paris, and she gave all her money away. She spent all of her time working on ways to improve the lives of those around her. She was a volunteer nurse in the Civil War, started a school for underprivileged girls, ran a hospital for veterans, became an author and a translator of French novels, lived to be 78 years old and never married, very fiercely independent. So I created this week-long road trip between her homes in Rhode Island and New Hampshire to kind of give her a chance to reflect, remember, reminisce, a few regrets, a few things she was very happy with. So it's really kind of a firsthand account of a fictional trip, but the details are all accurate and well researched. So it was a lot of fun.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Denny, you wrote The Trial of Mrs. Rhinelander?
Yes,
Is that correct? So tell us a little bit about that. What are we going to find in that?
Well, I'm going to tell you about two books because the one book that we are focusing on for Janis's Women's History Month is a co-authored work between myself, written by myself and Eliza Knight, called what was it called? Oh, Can They Be? I've written 5 books since then. Can't We Be Friends? And it's a novel of Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe, inspired by the research that Eliza and I started way back in 2019. And we just kept pressing our respective agents that we wanted to write this book because we found so much fabulous information about these two women, their friendship, and the time period they were closest, the 1950s, from 1952 to 1962. And then you mentioned my other novel, The Trial of Mrs. Rhinelander, which also came out in 2024. I feel like that was 10 years ago.
It was.
Yeah. Anyways, and that book is also inspired by actual events. The trial of a woman who in 1925 fell madly in love with a very wealthy real estate heir. They had a fabulous 3-year affair. They ended up getting married. And then 3 weeks after they were married, he sued her for an annulment based on the grounds that she did not mention she was a Negro. And that set off a 5-year court battle of various proportions. That was one of the national network news of that time period.
Fantastic. Wow. I knew nothing about that story. So that's really interesting. Piper, let's go to you. You wrote American Daughters.
Yes, that's correct. American Daughters is about the secret interracial friendship between Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, and Portia Washington, the daughter of Booker T. Washington. Not many people know that these two women were friends between 1901 and 1978 when Portia died. They both lived to be very old ladies. And I just found it interesting. One of my ongoing research interests has been interracial friendship. And I noticed a study that was recently released asking Americans, did they have a friend of another race? And not being surprised, but being, somewhat taken aback by the relatively high numbers in terms of people who don't have a friend from another race. And so when I came upon these mentions, and this is one of the things we'll talk about, I guess, in terms of research, basically scraps of mention regarding this relationship, the most public and overt factoid about their relationship as friends was in Portia's obituary in the Washington Post in 1978. But once I took a look at all of their life events and how they aligned, it made perfect sense that they would be, as Alice put it, compatriots in terms of their life. And so it gave me an opportunity to compare and contrast, or as I called it in my head as I was writing it, the white princess of America and the black princess of America were friends, and what that looked like in terms of the contrast between these two extremely privileged, and in Portia's case, relatively privileged women's lives over the course of the American century, and to tell that story as at least part of it, at least, it only goes to 1930. Right. So yes, exactly. There was more beyond that when they got up to more when they were fiendish old ladies, but that's for another day.
That'll be volume 2.
Yeah.
Right? Right. All right. And then I've written Daughters of Green Mountain Gap, and it's a story about 3 generations of healers in the mountains of North Carolina, in the Appalachian Mountains. The oldest generation, her name is Maggie, and she is what's called a granny woman. A granny woman is someone who uses herbs and roots, and what I say is a little bit of mountain magic, that idea that they have powers that allow them to heal. She has a daughter named Carrie Ann who chooses to become a nurse. She goes to Boston and tries to bring the modern medicine, at least at that time, what was modern, back into her community. And it sets up a real discord between her and her mother because their two methods don't always align. Carrie Ann also has a daughter who feels called into healing, and she's kind of looking at both and saying, well, which way do I go? Is it grandma's way? Is it mom's way? And yeah, the hope is maybe that people understand that there isn't necessarily one right way to heal, but that it's often a combination of methods. And that's kind of the gist of that book. And then Janis, you wrote The Path Beneath Her Feet. Yes.
So The Path Beneath Her Feet is a sequel to my debut novel, The Unlocked Path. And it's similar to Terry, explores women in medicine. The sequel is set 1936 to 1947 and celebrates my main character, who's fictionalized, but she represents women doctors of that time, when less than 5% of our doctors were women. And she is a graduate of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, the first medical school for women only. And that's covered in The Unlocked Path. But by 1936, Dr. Edwards is facing a career challenge, as so many did, losing work during the height of the Depression. And so she sets out on some new paths where she can redefine her career. First, she goes to Warm Springs, Georgia, to FDR's Rehabilitation Center for polio victims. And that's where she meets the incredible team that she learns from, actually, of women physical therapists that FDR called pioneers, that they would come to the rehabilitation center to work with the polio victims. From there, she goes fairly close to where Terry's set. She goes to Tennessee in Appalachia and is part of the American Women's Hospital Unit, which was a real-life unit that actually started in World War I, of women doctors forming to go to France to serve and take care of the French civilians during the war. And then by the height of the Depression, realizing the incredible need for health care, particularly in those rural areas where not everyone had a granny midwife or a healer in their community, and which we have today too often now as well, these healthcare deserts. So the American Women's Hospital, I really wanted to showcase in this book. And then I also wanted to elevate the awareness of some of the other real doctors that I came across in my research, including Dr. Olga Pavinsky, who worked with the New York Department of Public Health for 40 years and was instrumental in helping develop some of the toxins and vaccines for diphtheria and many other diseases. So I'm focused on women in medicine. I include a couple of real people, but my fictional character is a composite representing many of these women in medicine in the first half of the 20th century.
Wonderful, ladies. I would love now to open up the conversation a little bit, and let's just talk about why we think it's important to even write about these women in history. Like, what is it that gets us so revved up to do that? Does anyone have something they'd like to share?
I'll say that history revs us up because for so long, women, well, going back through time, weren't even allowed to put their feminine names on their work. That's a definite part of the history of women writing women's stories or writing any story. The evolution of that also led to more Black authors wanting to write about the history of Black pioneers, Black leaders, and be they in America or outside of America. So when I'm asked that question, I always point to history told us what to do, and that is to get the story out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Janis.
I'll just add that, I think I do a lot of speaking engagements at libraries, and I talk about the historical fiction genre and all. And so many people I hear from is, this was never in our history textbooks.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where were these stories, particularly of the women? And people are still lifelong learners too. And so they want to learn. They want to be inspired by our past. How can we learn from our past? Too often we don't learn from our past.
Exactly.
But at least elevating those stories, hopefully maybe people will realize that there are healthcare deserts again. And how do we address that? So I think it's that lifelong learning idea that people are still looking for, even later in life.
Absolutely. Yes.
And to piggyback off of what Janis is saying, a question I know I often get during speaking engagements is, why didn't you write a biography instead? And a biography is an academic endeavor that takes many, many years to bring across, because everything in terms of the story has to be footnoted and accounted for in terms of a biography. And so it's not that these lives are not worthy of such treatment. It's that it takes a long time and a lot of financial support as well during that time, a lot of pure focus to bring across that life in that particular way. But what I love about historical fiction, and particularly about the author's notes that we include at the ends of these stories, is that it would spark the desire in someone to take on potentially these longer, financially involved projects down the road. Is what one time I heard a speaker refer to it as historical fiction puts butts in seats in history classes. To have that interest, to be able to give these very worthy women that more in-depth treatment.
Absolutely.
I think good historical fiction starts with a story that resonates with people, and I think there's so few stories that have been told really well about women's achievements and women's accomplishments in the world. And I saw this as just a way to spark interest, open a door maybe for somebody that said, I'm not, I like reading fiction, but I would like to know more about, the Civil War, or how nursing became such a profession after the war, and the American Red Cross and all those kinds of things. And I think a good story opens that door, or that gate to, or a window, I guess, maybe use every metaphor I can think of, but a window maybe into finding out more, and starting with something that's entertaining as well as informative.
I have found that fiction, historical fiction, it's like an easy place to begin.
Mm-hmm.
So you have someone who maybe is a little bit afraid of something too deep. Maybe they would like to learn more about a topic, but oh wow, that big volume of facts looks really overwhelming. And storytelling is such a beautiful way of getting facts and understanding history. Some of my favorite history professors were those who could tell a good story, who turned all of these facts and figures that I was going to be forced to memorize into a story that now made sense and was beautiful and had this beginning, middle, and end, and you could follow through and put the facts in with that story. And then adding into that the women's stories that are so few and far between. I mean, it's getting better now, but I know as a child, there were very few women's stories to read. And I don't want that to be true for my granddaughters.
Right.
I want them to be able to pick up a book and see that when I tell my granddaughter that she can be something when she grows up, that she can be what she wants to be, I want her to have stories that she reads that proves that fact, instead of it just being empty words.
Yeah, that's great, Terry. And I was just going to add, talking about the learning, and it's not just the learning about the subject of the book, but all that's around it, as Gail kind of mentioned as well, that, I learned about healing practices in Appalachia, not just the women who practiced. In Piper's book, I learned about all the political maneuverings of elections and, securing votes and everything. From Can't We Be Friends, the entertainment industry. Oh my gosh, what goes on in that cutthroat business. And then even from Gail's book as well, life during that time, just driving a car in 1907 and, cranking it up and everything else. It's just amazing how much you can just sit and absorb and get interested. That can take you down to those rabbit holes. And we all know about the rabbit holes as well. But it's just inspiring to think how much we can learn beyond just the subject of the book.
So talking about rabbit holes, let's go there, because that's what research can do. I know that I can get down a research rabbit hole like a crazy person, but sometimes, especially when we're dealing with specific women or women's topics, it's a little difficult to find anybody who's willing to have mentioned them, especially as you go back further and further in time. Women are hardly a footnote, if a footnote. So how is it that you've been doing your research? Where are you finding your sources? What's the process like for you?
With Catherine, there was almost more information than I really needed. She was a writer. So in addition to the books that she actually wrote and translated, she also wrote lots of letters. So I had the opportunity to read those letters to try to get a sense of her as a person, not just the facts and the information, where she was born and what she liked to do, but it really gave me a sense of her personality, which I found to be a lot of not so much controversy, but just there was a lot of mixed messages. At one point, she was very frivolous and fun, and another part deadly serious and just almost like a bookworm. She was just going to be buried her face in a book. So I loved that, though. I loved all the the things that made me think like, wait, no, that's not her. Oh, I guess it is. So she was a lot of facets to her personality, which, like I said, through letters that she wrote and letters that she received, I was able to, I think, really get a good sense of her. In addition to the Library of Congress and all the other resources, she's also been the subject of a few other books. One of the subjects, I should say. So I was able to pull from those as well. So no shortage of information.
Okay, so Gail didn't find a shortage. Is there anyone that did find a shortage? Okay, let's talk about that, Denny.
Well, I'm going to go back to something Piper said when she was doing the research on the two women in American Daughters. She didn't even know about, if I heard you correctly, didn't even know about the relationship until there was an obit. So there wasn't a track through history. Same thing with Ella and Marilyn. The thing that brought Ella and Marilyn to Eliza Knight and my attention was frankly a photo of them at a party. There were two photos. One looked staged and they were sitting next to each other. And then the next one, someone caught them in an informal moment. And then there was a 1972 article in the premiere or debut magazine of Ms. Magazine, and they were acknowledging the 10-year anniversary seems like the wrong word, but commemorating the 10-year death of Marilyn Monroe and what had changed in society for those past 10 years. And that article had a quote from Ella Fitzgerald saying that Marilyn helped her do X, Y, and Z, or she never would have appeared at a certain club on the Sunset Strip. So that led us into the best kind of rabbit hole, where you at least know what part of the rabbit you're looking for.
Right,
and, right. So we definitely dove deep into finding this, that, and the other, and aligning their schedule. That's another point that Piper made. And you could just see where they were together, how they would have interacted, because a news story about a Marilyn Monroe's friendship with an Ella Fitzgerald was not a news story in the 1950s. Right. That was something that you kept on the, hush, hush, don't talk about it, that they're friends. So yeah, that was a different type of experience in terms of research. There was very little, but then again, there was a lot if you knew what you were looking for and had a discerning eye for how information was shared and written and what was the underlying point. And so, and I think that a lot of female authors, especially looking at the different authors of color in particular, the stories aren't documented at all, especially about the women. And so you really have to look at history that is usually written by men and sit back and go, well, what aren't the conquerors?
What aren't they telling? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, Denny's absolutely right in terms of talking about these the secret spaces or the silent spaces of the lacuna, to say that in 1901 you can't, even Alice Roosevelt, as feisty and as outrageous as she was, would not have come out and said, here's my buddy Portia, and we're hitting the road or whatever, in terms of that. And part of that, in order to think about it, is there's a certain amount of sadness in the fact that you have these stories, these silent stories that people couldn't talk about or wouldn't be able to say anything about. But it does matter. And this is why I think you have this flourishing of this kind of fiction by women authors now. It does matter who's doing the looking at the facts as they've been put into what, the historical repository of documents, whether they be primary resources or secondary resources. I know that, the authors here, all of you guys have probably gotten these questions from people who want to know what's documented and what's facts or whatever. And it's like, well, hey, dudes, and a lot of the times those questions do come from dudes. These things are not stated or put out there in the way in which you're expecting for that information to come across. And it does matter to look at those places and who is able to look at those resources to see just what might pop up in terms of story. Very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Janis, did you have any experiences while you were doing your research?
I was fairly fortunate that the best resource I had was with the Women's Medical College, where my first book takes place, because it was the first and longest running women's only medical school from 1850 to the early 1970s. And then it merged with Drexel, and Drexel acquired all the archival material. Mm-hmm. So I was able to spend full days in their basement archive office, and they pulled so many materials for me. Correspondence and grade reports and financial records, as well as, photographs. And they also stayed involved with this American Women's Hospital unit. So they had all these photographs of life in Appalachia in the 30s and the people that they were treating. And then the incredible maternity shelters they built, brand new, pristine buildings, with sterile environments for women. So I was very fortunate that way. But one other thing that I just came to me with my research was also the incredible support I've received from others. I had an article that Olga Pavinsky had written for the Journal of Immunology about one of her studies. I'm like, all right, I barely passed my Bio 101 class in college. So for me to decipher this journal article, I was like, I don't what? And I sent it on to a reader who had connected with me from my first book, and she was a retired doctor and had worked in bacteriology and immunology. And I said, could you translate this into layman's terms for me? And so she gave me a little bit, and then I wrote my scene and I sent it to her, and she goes, yeah, that works. So, also relying on, others and asking, not being afraid to ask in your research, to call on those experts in the field.
I did the same thing. I needed a disease, and I needed it to be something that could spread easily, but didn't necessarily spread to everyone. And I I had all of these things, and I reached out to several medical professionals and said, at this time period, we're not talking about today where we can get an antibiotic without a problem. I'm talking about in 1890s in the mountains of North Carolina. And yeah, they were able to help me. Oh, well, this would do it, or this kind of fever, or there were a lot of unknown fevers that they just called the fever, and it could have been any number of things. And those were always really good sources. I also have quite a bit about the Cherokee, a Cherokee medicine man and his beliefs and how he passed those on to Maggie. And she used some of those in her own practice. And I was able to find a really excellent resource because the North Carolina Cherokee, they have a website where they keep things. And I would go in there and I read all kinds of histories of different ceremonies that had been done and different dances and the different moons and how they celebrated them and herbs that were used for different things. And that was just a wonderful resource. Not that any one particular person used it, but that it was used at that time. And then how would my character have made use of that knowledge once she had gleaned it from the medicine man? So wonderful, ladies. In general, what are you hoping readers are going to get when they read your book or one of these 31? Like, what is it that we hope the most is going to come from this kind of endeavor?
Well, I hope that we spread the news of all of the books so that people buy them. There's that. And then I'm a big fan of what I've already learned about readers of Can't We Be Friends, what their reaction response has been, wow, this is a real friendship. And these women were there for each other. And they also had their own picadillos that made certain things in their lives more difficult to share with the other people in their lives and with each other. So it enlightened the reader and also was an emotional story for readers. And they saw things in the relationship that, as much writing as you might do with any story you put on the page and you get out to readers always see something more. They put themselves in the story. And I've always enjoyed learning that reaction and hearing how passionate or angry a reader can be about what they've read, how these people that I've researched or created have impacted them. So they have 31 books to have that relationship with.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
At least for me, in terms of American Daughters, I think a main theme is about women getting to do what they're passionate about doing. And the contrast between both Alice and Portia in terms of what happens when one gets to do what she wants to do and what happens when talents and gifts are wasted because of the isms that exist in our society. If we're not for some of these isms, then we might be in a far better place than we are now because of what someone is naturally gifted with and the ways in which society has worked to quash those gifts in certain people, I think is a very important aspect. When women don't get to be able to do what calls them or makes them feel more complete or whatever, that energy can be diverted in another way that isn't positive, isn't worthwhile in terms of that. So that for me is what I hope readers get to take. And I think that's the case for a lot of women's lives. There's always this seemingly fork in the road for women to make these choices in terms of that. And in 1901 and 1902 and 1903, when the characters exist, it always seemed that there was this one path, for them to go down. That might not have been the fulfilling thing. I think it's interesting to hear about Gail's protagonist not having married.
Right.
When I hear that about a woman from that particular time period, I'm always thinking about her, dodging like the bullet. Like, how did it happen? That to me is like the overarching question.
Yeah.
In terms of
it was certainly the path that her family expected. She had an older sister and a younger sister, and they were both married and married well. Not that the family needed more money, but they were very, I guess, happy in their marriages. Catherine, I read letters that she, says things like, to think that I would have to, get this, negotiate this situation or get approval on wanting to do this or that. The thought was just completely foreign to her. She just could not see doing that. But as the spinster daughter in her terms, she also was responsible for staying with her mother and helping her mother out when Catherine herself wasn't out, surfing in the war or doing other things. She did have to kind of stay home and take care of her mother as the spinster daughter. So there's trade-offs, I guess, with every choice you make.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think I just go back to kind of my catchphrase that I like to use with this whole program is inspire and educate. So, inspiring readers of learning about all of these women, they were all challenged in so many different ways, but they had that passion and they weren't going to be stopped because they wanted to realize their dreams. And I think that's important for our readers to take away and pass that forward too. Pass it on to their girlfriends, their daughters, their granddaughters, their nieces, their book club friends. That we all face challenges, but look what these women overcame and what they accomplished was truly amazing.
One of the things that I've noticed as I'm writing historical fiction is, as much as things have changed, they also remain the same. That there's a lot of things that don't really change. Piper brought up isms, and there were isms that aren't today's isms, but they still existed then, and there probably always will be, because we don't seem to figure things out very well, and we just keep repeating these same mistakes. So one of the things that I hope is that by looking at women's stories, that we can maybe see some of the mistakes, some of the mired places, and maybe not repeat those, so that we can keep going forward. And I think the other thing that is really amazing is, if you listen to history in a history class, you'd make an assumption that women pretty much did nothing until recently. Mm-hmm. And yet that is not true.
No.
So I hope that people recognize that women have been a force to have been reckoned with for as long as there have been women.
Right.
And just because someone didn't tell our story doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And that this isn't new. This isn't a modern invention where women have finally figured themselves out. We've known since women have been, but there were people who chose not to write and tell and keep up with those stories.
Sure. And then that's great, Terry. And this year's list, I'm happy to say, spans from 1st century with Princess Selene, daughter of Cleopatra, in Stephanie Drey's book, Lily of the Nile, all the way to the 1970s, which is just about on the cusp of what we all consider historical fiction, with Kristen Hanna's blockbuster, The Women, which is the collective representation of the Vietnam nurses. Right. So, the women's stories are out there. I'll just throw out a quote from Kate Quinn. She was on my last 2 lists, but I saw her speak this year. And to your point, Terry, she had a great comment of, as students of history and lovers of history, she'd often pause and say, but what were the women doing? We were reading about what was going on in history, but the women were part of that. What were they doing? So exactly. I think we've got 31 books on the list this year that are telling. That
will let you know what those women were doing. Well, everyone, follow the hashtag 31 titles women in history. Definitely check out the show notes, because I will have links for those of us who are on this show, as well as how to find all 31 books. And thank you, ladies, for being with me today. I've enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's going to be very valuable to my listeners.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry. And thank you, Janice, for coming up with the list.
Absolutely.
And stay tuned for next year. I have a feeling Mrs. Rylander will be on there. And check out prior lists for also Piper's appearance with By Her Own Design. The story of Anne Lowe is on one of the prior lists, too.
All righty. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.